In Female Chauvinist Pigs, Women and the Rise of Raunch Culture, Ariel Levy critiques how women's empowerment has been redefined through hypersexualization and the embrace of male-defined notions of sexuality. She argues that the rise of raunch culture, where women participate in and celebrate objectification, from Playboy aesthetics to stripper-inspired performances, does not equate to liberation. Instead, Levy suggests that many women, particularly those she calls female chauvinist pigs, internalize patriarchal values and seek validation through male approval, often at the expense of other women. She critiques the idea that imitating male chauvinism or engaging in self-objectification is a form of power, arguing that true feminism should challenge rather than conform to a system that reduces women to sexual objects. In this video, I'll take you through the book chapter by chapter, analysing key points and sharing my personal insights. Keep in mind that everything I discuss is my own interpretation, and I highly recommend reading the book yourself. This video is for educational purposes only and includes discussion of explicit themes. I will be addressing topics such as SV and SA. Additionally, throughout the video, I will refer to female chauvinist pigs as FCPs for brevity. Levy wrote this non-fiction book in 2005, at the height of the raunch culture she critiques. The early 2000s were saturated with sexualized images of women, especially in mass media. Before this, the cultural movement was all about girl power, popularized by girl bands such as the Spice Girls and cartoons like the Powerpuff Girls. I even had a Powerpuff Girls lunchbox. However, this shift laid the groundwork for films like Charlie's Angels, the rise of Girls Gone Wild, and the mainstreaming of pornography. Women were increasingly led to believe that embracing their own objectification was not only empowering, but essential. Femininity is shaped by patriarchal conditions, making it difficult to define on our own terms. This is because it has historically been constructed by the oppressors rather than by women themselves. Under patriarchy, gender is marketed in ways that reinforce male supremacy, resulting in an amalgamation of gender ideologies that are in conflict with one another. Consider a few examples. No means no, yet sex work is work. Religion is sexist, yet wearing religious garments is framed as a woman's choice. We condemn domestic violence, yet kink is consensual. These contradictions reveal the tensions within modern gender discourse. Femininity, shaped by male and white supremacy, has contributed to some of the worst atrocities against women. This includes the normalization of paedophilia and hebephilia, internalized misogyny, rigid beauty rituals, and the competitive pressure amongst women to prove their femininity. It also upholds male worship, the institution of marriage, and other oppressive norms. These harmful ideas stem from the rigid masculine-feminine dichotomy, which dictates and limits how gender is experienced. In this chapter, Levy outlines what raunch culture is. It is a cultural trend where hypersexualized imagery, behaviors, and attitudes, often reflecting male fantasies, are embraced and performed by women under the guise of empowerment. It manifests in things such as the normalization of pole dancing as fitness, the rise of Playboy-style aesthetics, and the idea that women demonstrating their sexual availability, often in a performative way for male approval, is a form of liberation. Levy critiques raunch culture for repackaging sexism as empowerment, arguing that it doesn't challenge traditional power structures, but instead reinforces them by encouraging women to define their worth through male desires. She distinguishes between genuine sexual liberation and a narrow commercialized version of it, one that often excludes deeper conversations around consent, pleasure, and autonomy. A key contradiction in raunch culture is that while it claims to be about female empowerment, it often reduces women to objects of desire rather than active agents of their own sexuality. It's about looking sexually liberated rather than actually being sexually free. Her first example is Girls Gone Wild. Girls Gone Wild refers to a controversial series of videos launched in the early 2000s that typically depict young women engaging in highly sexualized behavior, often while intoxicated, in spring break environments or other party settings. This behavior includes flashing the camera, making out with other women, and other heavily sexually suggestive acts. The franchise, created by Joe Francis, capitalized on the notion of wild or unrestrained female behavior, often showcasing women in sexually explicit situations, sometimes without clear consent or under questionable circumstances. The content of Girls Gone Wild is framed from the perspective of the male gaze, a concept coined by film theorist Laura Mulvey. This refers to the way in which media and visual culture position women as objects for pleasure and male desire. The franchise capitalizes on this dynamic, selling the fantasy of wild, sexually liberated women, but often ultimately catering to male viewers and reinforcing the idea that women's bodies exist for male enjoyment. Her next example is Jenna Jameson's book, How to Have Sex Like a Porn Star. Jameson is one of the world's most popular former porn stars. At its core, Jameson's book, much like the adult film industry, operates within a framework that commodifies women's bodies, reducing women to sexual objects for male pleasure. While Jameson claims to be empowering herself and other women through sexual expertise, the reality is that her career, and by extension her book, are built on the systematic objectification of her body. Pornography is not just an entertainment medium, it's a tool of patriarchal control. It exists to reinforce gender hierarchies, where male pleasure, desire, and fantasy are prioritized, while women's bodies are subjugated to the male gaze. Jameson, as one of the most famous porn stars, occupies a paradoxical position. While she presents herself as a subject with agency and control, her role within the industry reinforces the very norms that keep women subordinate. Her final example is Playboy. Playboy is part of a larger capitalist system that profits from the sexualization of women. The magazine's business model thrives on exploiting women's bodies for financial gain, often without genuinely addressing the broader social and political structures that contribute to women's inequality. Playboy exemplifies the commodification, objectification, and exploitation of women's bodies for male pleasure. It reinforces patriarchal values by positioning women as objects of desire and perpetuates gendered power imbalances, ultimately offering an illusion of empowerment while participating in systems of sexual exploitation. Levy uses the phrase, "the future that never happened," to reflect the gap between the feminist ideals of equality and liberation that were envisioned during the second wave feminist movement and the reality of the sexualized, commodified landscape that young women find themselves navigating today. Contemporary culture has transformed the feminist goals of sexual liberation and gender equality into commercialized, sexualized versions of empowerment that often benefits the male gaze and patriarchal interests. In this chapter, Levy argues that the vision of feminist progress has been hijacked by consumer culture, leading to a situation where women's empowerment is defined by their sexual appeal rather than their agency and autonomy. This creates a gap between the feminist ideals of the past and the current state of women's roles in society, hence the future that never happened. Hugh Hefner, founder of Playboy, made clear that the sexual revolution was only for men. He did this by appropriating the free love movement of the 1960s. Hugh Hefner represents a figure of patriarchal exploitation, where the empowerment he claimed to offer women is seen as illusory and ultimately reinforces male dominance. Hefner's empire, far from liberating women, commodified their bodies and reinforced social inequalities. The debate around Hefner's legacy remains, as liberals and men view him as a pioneer of sexual freedom, while feminists see him as a symbol of the ongoing objectification and marginalization of women in patriarchal society. In this chapter, Levy introduces the feminist Susan Brown Miller and her ideals surrounding rape and pornography. Her book, Against Our Will, Men, Women and Rape, is the first comprehensive history of rape ever published. She states that rape is nothing more or less than a conscious process of intimidation by which all men keep all women in a state of fear. When applying this logic to pornography, it shows that porn is the undiluted essence of anti-feminist propaganda, which feeds into the cycle of misogyny and woman-hating. However, men such as Hefner make the claim that rejecting pornography is actually anti-sex, which feeds into the liberal lie that pornography is good for women and sex, when in actuality, male sexual fantasies are often violent and nearly always show female submissiveness. Dworkin sums up succinctly why the anti-sexual ideology was so widely accepted. She states, "Equality in the realm of sex is an anti-sexual idea if sex requires domination in order to register a sensation." In short, Dworkin's quote suggests that if sex is perceived as requiring domination, in the sense of one person having power over the other in order to be pleasurable or meaningful, then the very foundation of sexual equality is undermined. She critiques a sexual culture where inequality is ingrained in the act of sex itself, arguing that true sexual liberation and equality cannot exist if sex is based on these power dynamics. For Dworkin, addressing sexual inequality requires not only changing individual behaviours, but also challenging the societal structures that normalise and reinforce these power imbalances in sexual relationships. Analysing raunch culture, Levy highlights its incompatibility with feminism by pointing out the absurdity of equating objectifying acts with meaningful feminist progress. She writes, stripping is as valuable to elevating womankind as gaining an education or supporting rape victims. Throwing a party where women grind against each other while fully clothed men watch them is suddenly part of the same project as marching on Washington for reproductive rights. This raises a crucial question. How does the display of women in revealing outfits, adhering to superficial beauty standards, actually contribute to a societal movement that critiques the very norms these women are pressured to conform to? One section that Levy incorrectly claims is that Andrea Dworkin and lawyer Catherine A. McKinnon, quote, joint forces, end quote, with a Republican mayor of Indianapolis, William Hadnot. To state this is to reduce a nuanced compromise into a misleading assumption. While McKinnon may have found herself aligned with certain conservative figures or Republicans on specific issues, most notably on anti-pornography laws, she has never fully joined forces with Republicans in the traditional sense. Her alliances have been more tactical and issue-specific rather than ideological, and her overall political stance remains aligned with feminist and progressive goals. Her feminist work is rooted in challenging power structures and inequality, which often places her at odds with the traditional conservative agenda. For example, her stances on reproductive rights and challenging patriarchal hierarchies. Another point of contention arises when Levy quotes feminist Jackie Cabellos, who says, "Women, use your brain, not your body." While this statement may seem empowering on the surface, it is classist and rooted in privilege. We can critique a system without demeaning the people it exploits. Imagine telling a woman in prostitution such a thing. How degrading and dismissive. We live in a patriarchal society that upholds male supremacy, enabling men to accumulate wealth and power. For many women, the harsh reality is that they are forced to engage in demeaning labour to survive. Ignoring this context and simply blaming women for their circumstances overlooks the broader social structures that shape their lives. The chapter opens with Levy observing an open discussion between Sheila Nevins, who was the vice president of HBO documentary films from 1999 to 2003. Nevins strongly defends the company's decision to air a documentary about strip clubs called G-String Divas. Levy notices that what Nevins is defending is not empowerment, but the status quo. Nevins becomes Levy's first example of a female chauvinist pig. Levy characterises female chauvinist pigs as post-feminist and humorous, women who embrace the female gaze and gender stereotypes as their version of empowerment. Why fight male oppression when you can simply join it? These women laugh along with men's sexism instead of challenging it, and in doing so, they actively participate in rape culture. Another example is Robin Quivers on The Howard Stern Show. On Stern's show, female guests are encouraged to take off their tops, while Stern and Quivers remain fully dressed. Quivers, by participating, becomes a kind of buffer, reassuring the audience that this behaviour is acceptable because she, as a woman, seems to think it's fine. While the male gaze critiques the way in which men look at women within patriarchy, women are also engaging in this gaze. Women are looking at women the way men look at women. However, women, unlike men, have to be sexy while objectifying other women. These women are Uncle Toms, which are people who deliberately uphold the stereotypes assigned to his or her marginalised group in the interest of getting ahead with the dominant group. Levy believes that female chauvinist pigs are Uncle Toms who deliberately conform to patriarchy. They fall into one of two categories: women who act like cartoon stereotypes of men drooling over women, or hyper-feminine girly girls who can only express their sexuality by spinning around a pole. The overall point of this chapter is to remind women that even if you act like a man, you will still be thought of as a woman by the dominant group, men. Levy writes, as long as womanhood is thought of as something to escape from, something less than manhood, you will be thought of as less too. This quote is about the deeply ingrained belief that women, simply by virtue of their gender, are lesser than men. It critiques the idea that women must escape or transcend their womanness to gain equal value and respect. As long as society sees womanhood as something negative or lesser, women will continue to be viewed and treated as lesser too. It's a powerful statement about how societal values on gender shape not only the treatment of women, but their self-worth and opportunities. Levy closes this chapter by warning FCPs that if you are the exception, that proves the rule. And the rule is that women are inferior. You haven't made any progress. I will summarise this chapter due to the fact that writing here was mostly anecdotal. In this chapter, Levy explores the phenomenon of women embracing masculinity, particularly in the form of hypermasculine behaviour and appearance. She discusses the way that some women, especially in certain subcultures, actively reject traditional femininity in favour of adopting a more traditionally masculine persona, what Levy refers to as the transformation of women to boys. Levy touches on the rise of lesbian communities and butch identities where women take on traditionally masculine traits. She also broadens the discussion to include broader cultural shifts, such as the increasing normalization of women participating in aggressive and sexualized behaviors traditionally associated with men, including the embrace of raunch culture. These women, she argues, often see themselves as challenging or rejecting patriarchal norms, but Levy questions whether this is truly empowering or simply an adoption of patriarchal ideas in disguise. She critically analyses the way that these women, through adopting these masculine behaviours, might be perpetrating the same gender stereotypes and structures that they aim to resist. By doing so, Levy argues that these women may be reaffirming the very values that they think they are subverting, aligning with male dominance and reinforcing societal expectations of what it means to be powerful or liberated. Levy's analysis of the women to boys shift is a commentary on how women sometimes adopt traits of masculinity in the pursuit of power or autonomy, but often without recognizing that these traits, especially when exaggerated into a form of hypermasculinity, are rooted in patriarchal systems of control. Levy is particularly concerned with how this cultural shift plays into raunch culture, which she critiques for its tendency to reduce women to objects for male consumption and to encourage women to embrace these roles rather than challenge them. In sum, From Women to Boys challenges the idea that adopting masculinity or rejecting femininity necessarily leads to empowerment for women. Levy questions whether these acts truly subvert the patriarchy or merely enforce its underlying values, ultimately calling into question the limits of what can be considered quote-unquote feminist or liberating, in a society still structured around male dominance. My main criticism of this chapter is that Levy overlooks how femininity itself is a construct shaped by patriarchy. It is not an inherent trait that women are born with, but rather a set of behaviours and expectations imposed and reinforced by patriarchal power structures. Moreover, rejecting femininity does not automatically mean embracing masculinity. This binary perspective is both restrictive and reductive, failing to account for the complexity of gender and all the diverse ways women navigate it. Similarly to the previous chapter, half of it is anecdotal. In the Pigs in Training chapter, Levy explores how young women are socialised into raunch culture, particularly through mainstream media and popular culture. She discusses how these women, often in their teens and 20s, are encouraged to embrace hypersexuality and adopt behaviours that cater to the male gaze. This chapter examines how girls are taught to view their bodies and sexuality in a way that prioritises male pleasure, using sex appeal as a form of power, yet one that ultimately reinforces patriarchal standards. Levy explains that this behaviour was not just about wanting to look attractive, but about a deeper cultural conditioning where women are taught to commodify their own sexuality. She points out that the rise of raunch culture that has made behaviours that were once acknowledged as degrading now appear as empowering or liberating, even though they still reinforce male-dominated ideas of sexuality and gender roles. Levy critiques how mainstream culture of the late 20th and early 21st centuries has shifted from traditional forms of female oppression to more insidious forms of self-objectification under the guise of empowerment. The term pigs in training refers to how women are essentially being groomed by society to conform to the expectations of raunch culture, where women become both the objects and agents of their own sexualization. This chapter also explores how these societal pressures are internalized, pigs in training are not just passive victims, they actively participate in the reinforcement of these standards. The rise of raunch culture, with its emphasis on sexualized women in media, is an example of how society has made this type of behavior more mainstream and acceptable. Women are led to believe that adopting hypersexual behaviors can be a form of power or independence, but Levy critiques this notion, arguing that it limits their true autonomy and perpetuates inequality. A key point in this chapter is sex ed for school students. The White House mostly funded abstinence-only programs rather than realistic sexual health that should be taught to students as soon as they are in school. This helps to protect children against older sexual predators and pedophiles. Additionally, this chapter focuses upon how girls are required to focus upon performance over pleasure, which leaves no room for female sexual desire. This is because our society has normalized women evaluating their bodies at all times, when we cry, when we eat, and when we have sex. All of these moments have been infiltrated by constant internal examination. Levy contextualizes this by writing, "They have never known a time when hoe wasn't part of the lexicon, when 16-year-olds didn't get breast implants, when porn stars weren't topping the bestseller list, when strippers weren't mainstream." Compared with today, when we have OnlyFans star Bonnie Blue saying that she is looking to, quote, bed barely legal girls, unquote. This is the complete internalization of patriarchal values. This is rape culture. She is grooming these teens while they are drunk and on spring break. Sound familiar? Female chauvinism is neither satire nor irony, despite what some may argue. It is not subversive, it is simply women upholding male entitlement and supremacy. Women who promote the humiliation of other women are not challenging the system, they are reinforcing it. By normalizing female objectification, they perpetuate a false sense of empowerment that ultimately serves patriarchy, not women. The Shopping for Sex chapter is a scathing critique of the commodification of women's sexuality in modern culture. Levy explores how societal norms and the media encourage women to internalize their value as sexual objects to be consumed, rather than as individuals with agency over their own bodies and sexual identities. While the increasing openness around sex is often framed as empowerment, Levy argues that it often functions to reinforce the same patriarchal structures that reduce women to their physical and sexual appeal. In this sense, sexual empowerment in the context of consumer culture is an illusion, as it is still shaped by male-dominated expectations. Levy's central argument is that while women are encouraged to shop for sex or present their sexuality as a commodity, this transactional approach to sex and relationships limits true freedom and autonomy. The chapter encourages readers to question the true nature of sexual liberation in a world where women's bodies and sexual identities are still predominantly defined by societal and patriarchal standards. It is crucial for women to understand that porn stars operate under multiple layers of control. The porn industry is worth approximately $15 billion, with the vast majority of profits going to mainstream corporate hosts, not performers themselves. Levy highlights a key distinction. Unlike other jobs such as acting or journalism, porn requires individuals to give up the most private aspects of their being for public consumption. However, she then makes the erroneous statement that sex workers are working. This claim relies on illogical reasoning requiring mental gymnastics to justify. She follows with the quote, "They are paid to do it, not because they are in the mood." By definition, that is rape. The consent model distorts this reality by stripping away social context, reducing the question of exploitation to a simple yes or no. It fails to account for power imbalances, whether the man is her boss, superior, physically stronger, or her only source of income. If the sex worker's work model were applied to other industries, its exploitative nature would be undeniable. Imagine a workplace where an employment contract required oral sex from female employees. If they signed the contract, what's the issue? They consented, right? Under this logic, coercion is rebranded as choice. Sex is not a service that can be commodified. Rape, however, can be. The vast majority of women in the sex trade are poor and enter it before the age of 18. Nearly all of them remain in poverty throughout their lives. Sex should be about pleasure or an expression of love, not a transaction. The ideal model for sex should center on the women who derive the most pleasure from it, and not those who earn the most money. In 1998, Dr. Melissa Farley studied 475 prostituted individuals using the same psychological criteria applied to military personnel. She found that 2/3 met the diagnostic threshold for PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Farley also states, pornography is a very specific form of prostitution in which prostitution occurs and is documented. This means that once recorded, it remains permanently accessible, circulating endlessly online or as downloaded content. Returning to Jenna Jameson, she reflects on this lasting impact, writing, "To this day, I can't watch my own sex scenes." This industry thrives on misogyny. Female arousal is irrelevant. It is, at best, barely concealed contempt for women. Why is watching a woman endure what is likely the worst day of her life considered arousing? Because our society has conditioned us to detach from the suffering of women who are degraded under patriarchy. Levy powerfully states, many women today, whether 14 or 40, seem to have forgotten that sexual power is only one very specific kind of power, end quote. All women must take a step back and truly examine what is happening to us. We are selling ourselves unbelievably short. We deserve better than what porn sites and OnlyFans creators market to us as freedom and fun. We deserve the space to explore what genuinely brings us pleasure, not what looks good, but what feels good. When critiquing patriarchal raunch culture, it's crucial to distinguish between criticizing the system and blaming its victims. We can challenge harmful systems without condemning the women caught within them. Understanding internalized misogyny is essential, as it shapes nearly every facet of how we perceive the world. At times, Levy leans too heavily on blaming women for succumbing to the very system that groomed them into becoming FCPs. It's important to recognize that many women cling on to patriarchy and misogyny not out of genuine belief, but out of necessity, because survival often requires it. Siding with one's oppressor isn't always a choice. Sometimes it's the only option to eat. This also underscores why transphobia has no place in feminism. Both cis and trans women are socialized to uphold misogyny under patriarchy. Singling out trans women for critique while ignoring how cis women often perpetrate in the same structures reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of oppression. This mindset only reinforces our status as an underclass. Moreover, it is reprehensible to weaponize a social justice movement to justify bigotry. Trans women are not our enemies, nor should they have to be perfect to deserve respect. When comparing Levy's book to Andrea Dworkin's Right-Wing Women, Levy adopts a much more hostile tone towards these women. She often blames them for internalizing the patriarchy's sexual value system without acknowledging that these behaviors are deeply ingrained through pervasive, lifelong propaganda. I understand how this can be infuriating. It's aggravating to witness an entire group complicit in their own oppression. However, despite this, I still firmly believe that this book is worth reading. Levy clearly illustrates how men shape expectations of female sexuality and how women internalize these beliefs as a result. Levy ends the book by writing, "We need to allow ourselves the freedom to figure out what we internally want from sex instead of mimicking whatever pop culture holds up to us as sexy. That would be sexual liberation." End quote. It's a powerful statement about the importance of authentic sexual agency and the necessity of freeing ourselves from external pressures that dictate what sex should look like.